What if the most expensive dress in the room became worthless in 3 seconds? That a charity gala celebrating family values would expose the ugliest truth about marriage, and that sometimes your water breaking in front of 400 people is exactly the wake-up call you didn't know you needed tonight. We're diving into Sarah's story, a woman who thought she had the perfect life, wealthy husband, beautiful home, baby on the way, but perfection can be the most dangerous illusion of all. So grab your favorite drink and prepare for a story about golden cages, hidden truths, and the moment one woman discovered that freedom had been in her hands all along. Hit that like button if you're ready for the truth. And don't forget to subscribe because stories like Sarah's remind us that we're stronger than we think. The sound of Sarah Mitchell's water breaking echoed through the marble ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel like a champagne flute shattering against stone. 400 of the city's elite turned in unison as the 8 months pregnant woman stood frozen in her torn designer gown, amniotic fluid pooling at her feet while camera flashes captured her humiliation. The moment stretched like a nightmare in slow motion. Sarah could hear the collective intake of breath from the crowd, the whispered comments beginning to ripple outward from the epicenter of her disaster. She felt exposed in ways that went far beyond the physical reality of her torn dress and broken water. This was the culmination of months of growing unease, the spectacular collapse of a carefully maintained facade. Her husband, Blake Harrison, stepped back immediately, his face twisted with disgust rather than concern. The movement was instinctive, automatic, as if her condition might be contagious. Sarah watched his expression cycle through emotions, shock, embarrassment, calculation, but never landing on the love or support she desperately needed. Jesus, Sarah, he hissed under his breath, his hand dropping from her arm like she'd become toxic. You couldn't wait 10 more minutes. The words hung in the air between them, audible to several nearby guests who couldn't help but overhear. Sarah saw Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows raise in shock, watched Mr. Whitmore's mouth tighten with disapproval. Even in her moment of crisis, she found herself cataloging the social damage Blake was inflicting with his callous response. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that 6 hours earlier, she'd been putting the finishing touches on her makeup, believing tonight would be their triumph. The Children's Hospital Gala was Blake's chance to cement his reputation as a family man and philanthropist. The Harrison name would grace the new pediatric wing. Their unborn daughter would grow up knowing her parents had made a difference. She'd spent 2 hours getting ready, carefully applying makeup to hide the exhaustion that had become her constant companion, choosing jewelry that would complement the custom gown without overwhelming her pregnant silhouette. Every detail had been planned to perfection, every contingency except this one considered and prepared for. Now, as hotel staff rushed forward with towels and paramedics were called, Sarah realized she'd been living in a carefully constructed illusion. The man who'd promised to love her through sickness and health was abandoning her at her most vulnerable moment, more concerned with damage control than his wife's welfare. The crystal chandeliers that had seemed so elegant an hour ago now felt like spotlights illuminating her humiliation. The marble floors that had reflected the glamour of the evening now served as a stage for her most embarrassing moment. Everything that had represented success and sophistication suddenly felt cold and hostile. Blake, she whispered, one hand pressed to her belly as another contraction built. The pain was sharp and immediate, cutting through the social embarrassment with biological urgency. Please, but Blake was already scanning the crowd, calculating the social cost of this disaster. His mind was working in crisis management mode. Sarah could see it in his eyes. He was already formulating explanations, planning damage control, strategizing how to minimize the impact on his carefully cultivated reputation. His business partner Amber Wells appeared at his side with practiced efficiency, her red hair perfectly styled despite the chaos. She moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of someone comfortable navigating crisis, positioning herself exactly where Blake needed support without appearing to orchestrate the moment. She placed a comforting hand on Blake's arm, the gesture so natural it spoke of months of intimate familiarity. The touch was brief but possessive, a claiming that Sarah recognized even in her distressed state. This wasn't the first time Amber had provided comfort to Blake, and it wouldn't be the last. Don't worry, Amber murmured to Blake, her voice carrying just far enough for Sarah to hear. The words were clearly intended to be overheard, a message delivered with surgical precision. We'll handle this. Everything we've planned stays on track. The words hit Sarah like ice water, even as another contraction built in intensity. Everything they'd planned. Not everything Blake had planned for his business. Not everything Blake had planned for the evening. Everything they'd planned together. The pronoun choice was deliberate. Sarah was certain. This wasn't business contingency planning. This was personal strategy, intimate coordination between two people who had clearly been working together for longer and more closely than Sarah had ever imagined. The casual intimacy of the moment revealed months, maybe years, of shared secrets and coordinated deception. As the paramedics loaded Sarah onto a stretcher, she caught sight of Blake's 17-year-old son Jake pushing through the crowd, his young face tight with anger and concern that his father should have been showing. Jake's eyes were bright with unshed tears of fury, his jaw set with the righteous indignation that only teenagers could muster when confronting adult hypocrisy. "Dad, what the hell is wrong with you?" Jake demanded, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the crowd. The question was simple but devastating in its directness, cutting through all the social protocols and expectations to the heart of the matter. But Blake was already following Amber toward the exit, leaving his pregnant wife to face whatever came next without him. The abandonment was so complete, so callous, that several people in the crowd exchanged shocked glances. This wasn't just social awkwardness or crisis management, this was cruelty. Sarah closed her eyes as the stretcher rolled toward the ambulance, finally understanding that tonight wasn't just about giving birth to her daughter. It was about giving birth to the truth she'd been avoiding for months. Her marriage was over. Her financial security was an illusion, and the man she'd trusted with her future had been systematically destroying it while she'd been focused on creating new life. The contractions were coming faster now, each one more intense than the last, but they were nothing compared to the pain of recognition flooding through her consciousness like a dam bursting. She was about to become a single mother, whether she'd planned it or not. The realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she was moving toward truth rather than away from it. Sarah stood before her full-length mirror, adjusting the navy silk maternity gown that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. The custom piece accommodated her 8-month belly while maintaining the elegance Blake demanded for public appearances. She caught her reflection and paused, noting the exhaustion around her eyes that even expensive concealer couldn't hide. The bathroom counter was cluttered with the tools of transformation foundation 3 shades lighter than her natural skin tone. Concealer to hide the dark circles that had become permanent fixtures. Highlighter to create the illusion of vitality she no longer possessed naturally. The routine had become increasingly elaborate over the past months, each product a small lie designed to maintain the facade of the perfect pregnant wife. "Remember, Madame," Blake said, fastening diamond earrings around her neck with fingers that lingered possessively rather than lovingly. "Tonight is about establishing our legacy. The Harrison family pediatric wing needs to feel personal, emotional, but not too emotional. You know how these people are about public displays." His touch felt clinical, like a stylist preparing a mannequin for display. Sarah tried to remember when his hands had last conveyed affection rather than ownership. When he'd touched her because he wanted to, rather than because the gesture served some larger purpose. Sarah nodded automatically, her mind elsewhere. This morning she'd found a tube of coral lipstick in Blake's car, a shade she'd never worn. The brand was expensive, the color bold and youthful, everything Sarah had been encouraged to avoid during her pregnancy. When she'd mentioned it casually over breakfast, Blake's explanation had been smooth and immediate. Amber had felt car sick during yesterday's site visit and had used his car to touch up her makeup. Perfectly reasonable. Except Sarah remembered Blake saying yesterday's meeting had been virtual, conducted from his home office, while she'd been in the same house all day. The contradiction had nagged at her through the morning routine, joining the growing collection of small inconsistencies that never quite added up to proof but felt increasingly significant in their accumulation. Like the restaurant charges from places Blake claimed never to have visited, or the business trips that seemed to require more overnight stays than geography could justify. "Are you listening to me?" Blake's voice carried the edge that always made Sarah's stomach clench. The tone that suggested her attention was a finite resource he owned and she was squandering. "I need you focused tonight. The Peterson deal closes next week, and maintaining these relationships is crucial." The Peterson deal had become Blake's obsession over the past 6 months, consuming his attention and providing convenient explanation for his increasing absence from their home and marriage. Sarah had stopped asking for details about his work months ago, after repeated conversations where Blake had made her feel stupid for not understanding the complexities of commercial real estate development. Of course, Sarah replied, forcing brightness into her voice. She'd perfected this tone over the years, the sound of enthusiastic agreement that masked any trace of doubt or independent thought. I understand how important tonight is. Blake's phone buzzed, and Sarah caught the brief smile that crossed his face before his expression returned to neutral. The smile was genuine, spontaneous, unlike the careful expressions he maintained during their interactions. She watched him type a quick response, his thumbs moving with the fluency of frequent communication, the same muscle memory that came from texting someone daily. Amber's already at the venue handling last-minute details, Blake said, pocketing the phone with what seemed like reluctance. She's been invaluable with the international expansion, really knows how to structure these complex deals. The way Blake spoke about Amber had changed over the past year. Sarah realized with sudden clarity, there was warmth there, admiration, even pride emotions that had gradually disappeared from his voice when he spoke about Sarah or their marriage. She couldn't remember the last time he'd described her work with such enthusiasm, though that was partly because she'd stopped working at the art gallery 6 months ago. The decision to leave the gallery had been presented as mutual, a natural transition as they prepared for parenthood. But looking back, Sarah could see how Blake had systematically undermined her confidence in her professional abilities, questioning her judgment, criticizing her colleagues, making her feel guilty for spending time away from home during her pregnancy. "Ready?" Blake asked, offering his arm with the practiced gesture of a man comfortable with performance. The movement was automatic, devoid of the tenderness that had once characterized their physical connection. As they descended the marble staircase of their colonial mansion, Sarah felt the baby kick strongly, as if protesting the tension that seemed to permeate every interaction between her parents. The house that had once felt like a dream home now seemed more like a beautifully appointed prison, every room filled with memories of conversations that had gradually grown shorter and less meaningful. She pressed her hand to the spot where her daughter's foot had connected with her ribs, wondering if her unborn child could sense the growing distance between the people who were supposed to love her most. The thought was heartbreaking that even before birth, their daughter was being exposed to the emotional dysfunction that had infected their marriage. The drive to the hotel passed in relative silence, Blake fielding calls about zoning permits and market forecasts, while Sarah stared out at the city lights. The familiar landmarks looked different somehow, as if she were seeing them through glass that distorted everything slightly. She'd once found his ambition attractive, the way he could command attention and reshape situations to his advantage. Now it felt like living with a machine programmed solely for acquisition and advancement, incapable of genuine emotional connection or spontaneous affection. The man beside her bore only superficial resemblance to the person she'd fallen in love with 5 years ago. "The valet will help you out," Blake said as they pulled into the circular drive. "I need to check in with the event coordinator before we make our entrance." The phrasing struck Sarah as significant. Before we make our entrance, not before we go in together, or before we join the party. An entrance was a performance, a calculated moment designed for maximum impact. Their marriage had become a series of entrances, each one more carefully choreographed than the last. Sarah watched through the car window as Blake strode through the hotel lobby, his confidence magnetic even from a distance. Amber appeared immediately, materializing from behind a marble column as if she'd been waiting specifically for his arrival. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Amber had been watching for Blake, anticipating his arrival with the precision of someone intimately familiar with his schedule and habits. They stood closer together than any business conversation required, Amber's hand resting on Blake's arm as they spoke. The gesture was subtle, professional enough to maintain plausible deniability, but Sarah could see the intimacy in their body language. The way Amber leaned toward Blake, the way he unconsciously mirrored her posture, the comfortable silence between words that spoke of countless previous conversations. The gesture was subtle, professional enough to maintain plausible deniability. But Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she watched them. The way they moved together spoke of a familiarity that extended far beyond quarterly reports and expansion strategies. This was the easy intimacy of two people who knew each other's rhythms, who could communicate with glances and gesture rather than words. How long had she been the only person who didn't see what was happening right in front of her? How long had she been performing the role of the perfect wife while Blake and Amber conducted their real relationship in plain sight? The Grand Metropolitan's ballroom glittered with old money and new power. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables laden with fresh orchids and political influence. Sarah navigated the pre-dinner conversations with practiced ease, her smile never wavering despite the growing discomfort in her lower back and the persistent feeling that she was performing in someone else's production. "Sarah, darling, you absolutely glow," gushed Mrs. Whitmore, whose husband owned half the commercial real estate downtown. "When are you due?" "6 weeks," Sarah replied, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "We're very excited. Your first—" The question always carried undertones Sarah had learned to recognize. Blake had a son from his previous marriage, and the implication was always there that second families were somehow different, less legitimate. "Yes, our first together. Blake has Jake from his previous marriage." Mrs. Whitmore nodded knowingly. "Second families can be such a blessing. Sometimes a man needs to mature before he truly appreciates fatherhood." The comment hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. Blake had been largely absent during Jake's early years, building his business empire while his first wife managed the actual parenting. He'd promised this time would be different, but watching him work the room tonight while she managed the social pleasantries, Sarah wondered if people ever really changed their fundamental nature. "Sarah, congratulations on the baby." Amber appeared at her elbow, champagne flute in hand, and that knowing smile that had become familiar over the past 18 months. "Blake has told me so much about your situation." The word situation landed like ice water down Sarah's spine. She studied Amber's face, searching for clues about what exactly Blake had shared about their marriage, their pregnancy, their private life. "Thank you," Sarah managed. "I didn't realize you and Blake discussed personal matters so extensively." Amber's laugh was light, musical. "Oh, we discuss everything. Business partnerships require such trust. Don't you think complete transparency—" Something in Amber's tone made Sarah's stomach clench, the baby rolling uncomfortably against her ribs. "Of course," Sarah said carefully, "though I imagine most business discussions focus on financial matters rather than family planning." "You'd be surprised," Amber replied, her eyes glittering with what might have been amusement. "The personal and professional intersect in fascinating ways, especially when planning for the future." Before Sarah could respond, Blake appeared at her side, his hand settling possessively on her lower back. "Amber, I see you've met my wife properly." The phrasing was odd. They'd been introduced multiple times over the past year and a half. Why would Blake suggest this was their first proper meeting? "We were just discussing transparency in business relationships," Amber said smoothly, "and future planning." Blake's fingers pressed slightly harder against Sarah's spine. "Amber has been invaluable in structuring our Caribbean expansion. Very forward-thinking approach to asset management." The conversation felt loaded with subtext Sarah couldn't decipher. She was listening to a foreign language where she recognized individual words but missed the full meaning. Blake and Amber stood just slightly too close, their body language suggesting a familiarity that extended beyond professional collaboration. "I should return to my table," Amber said. "The silent auction closes soon, and I have my eye on that lovely Tuscany vacation package. Perfect for a romantic getaway." She walked away with fluid confidence, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and unanswered questions. "She seems very involved in your business," Sarah observed. "She's dedicated," Blake replied, but his eyes followed Amber's progress across the room. During dinner, Sarah found herself studying the other couples at their table, noting the casual intimacy between long-married pairs, the way they included each other in conversations and shared private jokes. When had she and Blake stopped being a team and become co-performers in an elaborate show? Her phone buzzed with a text notification. She glanced at it discreetly, expecting perhaps a message from Jake or her friend Dana. Instead, she saw a credit card alert for a charge at Chez Laurent, an expensive downtown restaurant. Yesterday evening, Sarah remembered yesterday clearly because Blake had claimed to be working late on the Peterson deal, grabbing dinner at his desk. She'd waited until nearly 10 o'clock before eating alone, the carefully prepared meal growing cold as she watched the clock. The pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling for months were finally clicking into place. The late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the business trips that seemed to require more time away from home. Amber's easy familiarity with Blake's schedule and preferences, the way he'd been increasingly distant and critical, as if preparing for some inevitable separation. Another kick from the baby, stronger this time, made her gasp softly. The movement felt different somehow, more urgent and uncomfortable than the usual stretching and rolling. "Everything all right?" asked Dr. Patterson from across the table, his medical training making him sensitive to signs of distress. "Just tired," Sarah managed. "It's been a long day." But even as she spoke, she realized that exhaustion was only part of what she was feeling. The recognition that had been building all evening was crystallizing into certainty. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't pregnancy hormones making her oversensitive. This was happening, had probably been happening for longer than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. The evening's entertainment began as dessert plates were cleared, Crystal singing as servers moved efficiently through the crowd. A local singer took the small stage, her voice floating over conversations about market trends and vacation homes. The atmosphere was sophisticated, civilized, everything Sarah had once aspired to be part of when she'd first entered Blake's world. Couples moved to the designated dance floor with the practiced grace of people accustomed to being watched and admired. Sarah recognized several faces from magazine spreads and society pages, people whose lives seemed effortlessly elegant from the outside. She wondered how many of them were also performing, how many marriages in this room were held together by convenience rather than love. Blake stood and offered Sarah his hand, the gesture automatic rather than romantic. His movements had the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions without emotional investment. She could see him calculating the social benefit of dancing with his pregnant wife, the photo opportunity it would provide for tomorrow's society coverage. "I'm not sure I'm up for dancing," Sarah said, pressing her hand to her lower abdomen, where another cramp had started building. The sensation was different from the baby's movements, sharper and more demanding of attention. Her body felt strange tonight, restless in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. "Just one song," Blake insisted, his tone carrying the edge of command rather than request. "For appearances." The phrase crystallized everything Sarah had been feeling throughout the evening. For appearances. Not because he wanted to hold her, not because he enjoyed dancing with his pregnant wife, not because this might be one of their last opportunities to dance together before their daughter arrived, because their absence from the dance floor might be noticed and commented upon by people whose opinions mattered to Blake's business interests. Sarah allowed herself to be helped to her feet, noting how Blake's assistance felt dutiful rather than caring. Every gesture between them had become transactional, calculated for its effect on observers rather than its meaning for the participants. They moved together with practiced efficiency, Sarah's hand in his other hand resting carefully on her back to avoid her rounded belly. To anyone watching from the surrounding tables, they looked like a devoted couple sharing a tender moment before the arrival of their first child. The image was perfect, the reality hollow. Sarah could feel the distance between them even as they moved in rhythm to the music. Blake's attention was divided, his eyes scanning the crowd over her shoulder, his mind clearly elsewhere. She'd become a prop in his performance rather than a partner in their marriage. The singer's voice wrapped around them, a song about enduring love that felt like mockery given the state of their relationship. Sarah tried to remember the last time they danced because they wanted to, the last time Blake had looked at her with genuine affection rather than calculation. "Amber seems very invested in your business success," Sarah said quietly, testing the waters of honesty that had become increasingly treacherous in their conversations. Blake's response was immediate, defensive in a way that confirmed her suspicions. "She's ambitious," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I respect that in a business partner." The word respect hung between them like a challenge. Sarah couldn't remember the last time Blake had spoken about her with respect, or to her with the same regard he clearly held for Amber's professional capabilities. "Is that all she is, a business partner?" Blake's hand tightened slightly on her back, his grip becoming possessive rather than supportive. The pressure was just shy of painful, a warning disguised as intimacy. "What kind of question is that?" His voice carried the tone he used when he wanted her to feel foolish for asking something obvious, the same inflection that had trained her over the years to doubt her own perceptions. "The kind a wife asks when she notices things," Sarah replied, surprising herself with her directness. The words came from some reservoir of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. The voice of the woman she'd been before Blake had systematically undermined her confidence. Blake missed a step in their dance, his rhythm faltering almost imperceptibly. The stumble was brief but telling. She'd caught him off guard, penetrated his careful composure with an observation he hadn't expected her to make. "You're being paranoid," Blake said, his voice cooling to the temperature he reserved for difficult business negotiations. "Pregnancy hormones can make women imagine all sorts of things." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that Sarah almost accepted it automatically. Almost. She'd spent years learning to distrust her own observations, to second-guess her instincts whenever they conflicted with Blake's version of reality. But tonight, with the physical discomfort making her less patient with social niceties, she found herself less willing to be dismissed. "I'm not imagining the charge from Chez Laurent yesterday," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the contraction building in her abdomen. "The restaurant where you definitely weren't having a working dinner." The words hung between them like an accusation, impossible to ignore or deflect. Sarah watched Blake's face cycle through emotions: surprise, calculation, anger before settling on cold control. Blake missed another step, his rhythm faltering more noticeably this time. Several couples dancing nearby glanced over, noting the disruption in their perfect synchronization. "You're monitoring my credit card statements now." His voice carried disbelief and indignation, as if her awareness of their shared finances was an invasion of his privacy rather than her right as his spouse. "The notification came to my phone by mistake," Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact despite the intimidation in his expression. "Though that's not really the point, is it?" She could see him processing this information, calculating how much she might know, how many other inconsistencies she'd noticed and filed away. The realization that she'd been paying attention, that she'd been assembling evidence of his deception, clearly unsettled him. The song ended with a flourish, and Blake stepped back from her immediately, his public smile snapping into place as other couples continued dancing around them. The transformation was jarring from cold anger to warm charm in the space of a heartbeat. "We'll discuss this at home," he said, his voice low and warning. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. She would pay for this challenge to his authority, this public questioning of his carefully constructed narrative. "Tonight is about the hospital, not your insecurities." But as he guided her back to their table with his hand possessively on her arm, Sarah caught Amber watching them from across the room. The other woman's expression was knowing, almost satisfied, as if she'd witnessed exactly what she'd expected to see. There was something predatory in Amber's gaze that made Sarah's skin crawl. The look of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of confrontation. The cramp that hit Sarah as she sat down was strong enough to make her breath catch, forcing her to grip the edge of the table for support. Different from the baby's movements, more urgent and concerning. She pressed her hand to her belly, trying to determine if this was something she should worry about or just the stress of the evening manifesting physically. Dr. Patterson noticed her distress immediately, his medical training making him sensitive to signs of labor. "Mrs. Harrison, are you experiencing contractions?" "I'm not sure, Sarah admitted, grateful for his professional concern. "The sensations are different tonight, sharper." Blake's attention snapped to her, but his expression showed annoyance rather than concern. Another medical crisis would further complicate his carefully planned evening, potentially overshadowing the business connections he'd worked months to cultivate. The program continued with speeches from hospital administrators and major donors, but Sarah found it increasingly difficult to focus on the words. Her body felt strange, restless and uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with her usual pregnancy complaints. And her mind kept circling back to Amber's knowing smile, Blake's defensive reaction to her questions, and the growing certainty that her carefully constructed life was built on foundations far shakier than she'd ever allowed herself to acknowledge. The recognition was building like storm pressure, impossible to ignore despite years of conditioning that taught her to minimize her own perceptions. She was no longer just a pregnant woman attending a charity gala with her husband. She was a woman on the verge of discovering truths she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. carrying a child whose father might already be planning a future that didn't include either of them. As the evening progressed toward its climax, Sarah realized she was standing at the edge of a cliff. The fall might destroy her, but staying where she was had become impossible. The recognition was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like finally admitting that the ground beneath her feet had been crumbling for months. The applause died down as Blake stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the ballroom. Sarah watched from her seat at the head table, her hands folded over her belly, trying to ignore the increasingly uncomfortable cramping that had started during dessert. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "Tonight represents more than just a charitable donation. It represents our commitment to the future, to the children who will benefit from the world-class care this new pediatric wing will provide." Sarah had heard him practice this speech at home, perfecting the pauses and inflections that would maximize emotional impact. He was gifted at this, at reading a room and delivering exactly what his audience wanted to hear. It was one of the qualities that had first attracted her to him, this ability to make people believe in his vision. "My beautiful wife Sarah and I," Blake continued, gesturing toward her with practiced warmth, "are thrilled to announce our partnership with Metro Children's Hospital. Family means everything to us. Every child deserves the best possible start in life, and we're honored to help make that possible." The spotlight found Sarah, and she smiled reflexively, raising one hand in a small wave. The audience applauded, and she felt the familiar flush of public attention. But underneath the performance, her mind was processing the words Blake had chosen. Our partnership. Family means everything to us. The lies delivered with such conviction that even she almost believed them. The Harrison Family Pediatric Wing will feature state-of-the-art equipment, private family rooms, and dedicated spaces for siblings and extended family members. Blake continued, "Because healing happens best when families can stay together during the most challenging times." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly as another cramp seized her. The baby had been unusually active all evening, and now these new sensations were layering on top of the constant movement. She tried to breathe through the discomfort, maintaining her smile as cameras flashed and the audience hung on Blake's every word. "Now I'd like to invite Amber Wells, our international business development specialist, to join us for a photograph," Blake announced. "Amber has been instrumental in structuring the financial aspects of this donation, ensuring maximum impact for our investment." Sarah's smile faltered slightly as Amber glided toward the podium, her red hair catching the stage lights like fire. She positioned herself on Blake's other side, close enough that their shoulders touched, while Sarah remained seated due to her advanced pregnancy. The photographer called out instructions. "Mr. Harrison, if you could put your hand on your wife's shoulder, Mrs. Wells, perhaps lean in slightly for the group shot." As they arranged themselves for the photos, Amber leaned close to Sarah under the guise of positioning for the camera. "You must be so tired," Amber whispered, her voice low enough that only Sarah could hear. "Pregnancy is exhausting, especially at your age. I can't imagine trying to keep up with Blake's schedule while carrying all that extra weight." Sarah was 29 years old. Amber knew this perfectly well. The words were delivered with the appearance of sympathy, but they landed like small, precise cuts. Sarah maintained her smile for the cameras while processing the casual cruelty of the comment. "Smile a bit wider, Mrs. Harrison," called the photographer. "This one's for the society pages." Sarah complied, her face aching from the sustained expression of joy and gratitude. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying every interaction she'd had with Amber over the past 18 months. The business lunches she'd been excluded from, the weekend work sessions that seemed to require Amber's presence at their home, the way Amber spoke about Blake's plans and preferences with an intimacy that suggested knowledge extending far beyond professional collaboration. Another photographer joined the first, and the session continued. Sarah watched Amber work the camera with professional skill, her poses natural and confident. When had Sarah lost that ease, that comfort in her own skin? She remembered being confident once, passionate about her work at the art gallery, excited about building a life with Blake. Now she felt like a supporting character in someone else's story. "That should do it," Blake announced, stepping back from the podium. "Thank you all for your continued support." The applause was thunderous, and Sarah struggled to her feet to acknowledge it properly. The movement sent another sharp cramp through her lower abdomen, stronger than the previous ones. She gripped Blake's offered arm, using him for balance as much as for show. But as Blake guided her away from the podium, his cufflink caught on the delicate beading of her sleeve. The designer gown, weakened by the stress of accommodating her pregnant form, couldn't withstand the sudden tension. The fabric tore with an audible ripping sound that seemed to echo through the ballroom despite the ongoing applause. The tear ran from shoulder to waist, exposing Sarah's maternity undergarments and in the full curve of her pregnant belly to 400 of the city's most influential residents. Gasps rippled through the crowd as camera flashes continued, now capturing not a triumphant moment, but a humiliating accident. Sarah stood frozen, one hand instinctively trying to hold the ruined fabric together, while the other remained trapped in Blake's grip. The exposure felt like more than just physical nakedness. It was as if all her carefully maintained facades had been stripped away in an instant, leaving her vulnerable and diminished before an audience of strangers. But even as hotel staff rushed forward with towels and the crowd's murmur grew louder, Sarah felt something else building alongside the humiliation. The recognition that this moment, devastating as it was, had finally torn away the last of her illusions about her marriage. Blake stepped back from her immediately, his face showing disgust rather than concern. This was the father of her unborn child, the man who had promised to love and support her through sickness and health, and he was looking at her like she was an inconvenience that had ruined his evening. Then her water broke. The warm gush of amniotic fluid pooling at Sarah's feet transformed the ballroom's atmosphere from social embarrassment to medical emergency. The murmur of concerned voices grew louder as people began to understand what they were witnessing. Cell phones appeared, capturing what would undoubtedly become gossip fodder for months to come. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her free hand moving to her belly as the reality of the situation crashed over her. This was actually happening. Here, now, in front of everyone who mattered to Blake's career and social standing. The crowd seemed to divide into two distinct groups, those who moved closer to help and those who stepped back to avoid being associated with the spectacle. Sarah noticed which category most of Blake's business associates fell into, their careful distance speaking volumes about the superficial nature of relationships built solely on mutual advantage. Blake stepped back from her immediately, as if her condition might be contagious. "Jesus, Sarah," he hissed under his breath. "You couldn't wait 10 more minutes." The casual cruelty of his response hit Sarah like a physical slap. Here she was, 8 months pregnant and clearly in distress. And Blake's primary concern was how her condition might affect his image. She caught sight of several women in the crowd whose expressions ranged from sympathy to horror. Not at her medical emergency, but at Blake's callous reaction. Dr. Patterson pushed through the crowd, his medical training overriding social protocol. "Mrs. Harrison, are you hurt?" he asked, his voice cutting through the ambient confusion. His presence brought immediate authority to the situation, transforming it from social catastrophe to medical priority. But before Sarah could answer, another contraction hit, stronger than anything she'd experienced before. This wasn't false labor or stress-induced cramping. This was the real thing, and it was happening whether Blake was emotionally present or not. The pain was sharp and demanding, cutting through all the social anxiety and performance pressure like a blade. "Call an ambulance, Josh," Dr. Patterson was saying to someone. "And clear some space around her." Jake appeared at Sarah's side, having pushed through the crowd with determined urgency. His young face was flushed with exertion and bright with protective anger that made him seem older than his 17 years. "Sarah, I called 911. They're on their way," he announced, his voice carrying more genuine concern than she'd heard from any adult in the room. "How can I help? What do you need?" "Thank you," Sarah managed, gripping Jake's offered hand during the next contraction. His solid presence anchored her in a way that Blake's performance never could. This teenager understood something about loyalty and family that his father had never learned. Blake finally seemed to remember his role as concerned husband, stepping closer with what looked like appropriate worry to anyone watching from a distance. But Sarah could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he positioned himself for the cameras that were still flashing despite the medical emergency. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, but his voice carried the tone of someone going through the motions rather than genuine emotional investment. It was the same voice he used when asking about her day while scrolling through his phone. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in months. The face she'd once found handsome and charming now seemed calculating and cold. The man she'd thought she'd married was nowhere to be found in this stranger who prioritized appearances over authenticity. Success over love? The contrast between Blake's hollow concern and Jake's fierce protectiveness crystallized something for Sarah. She could see the man Blake might have been if he'd chosen differently, if he'd prioritized connection over control. Jake was showing her what genuine care looked like, and it bore no resemblance to Blake's performance. "You can stop pretending you care," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite everything that was happening to her body. Blake's carefully constructed public mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly and resentful underneath. Several people in their immediate vicinity heard the exchange, and Sarah saw recognition flicker across their faces. The perfect marriage facade was crumbling in real time. "Sarah, you're being hysterical. This isn't the time." "No," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is exactly the time, and for once in our marriage, I'm going to say what I actually think instead of what you want to hear." A woman in the crowd gasped softly at the public confrontation, but Sarah found she no longer cared about causing a scene. The worst possible thing had already happened. Her water had broken in front of 400 people while wearing a torn dress. There was literally nothing left to lose in terms of social embarrassment. The paramedics arrived as Sarah was speaking, their professional competence cutting through the social awkwardness like a blade. They surrounded her with equipment and questions, transforming her from a social spectacle into a medical patient requiring immediate attention. Their efficiency was comforting after hours of navigating the artificial protocols of high society. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, Sarah caught sight of Amber in the crowd. The other woman was no longer smiling. Instead, she was watching Blake's face with calculating intensity, as if gauging how this development might affect whatever plans they'd been making together. There was something predatory in Amber's assessment that made Sarah's skin crawl. The realization hit Sarah with startling clarity. Amber wasn't just interested in Blake romantically or professionally. She was interested in what Blake's life might look like without Sarah in it. Tonight's disaster wasn't an unfortunate accident, it was an opportunity. A chance to accelerate whatever timeline they'd already established for Sarah's exit from Blake's life. Mrs. Whitmore approached the stretcher with genuine concern, pressing Sarah's hand briefly. "Take care of yourself, dear," she whispered. "Some of us have been watching, and we see more than you might think." The comment was cryptic, but somehow comforting, suggesting that Sarah's isolation might not be as complete as she'd believed. In the ambulance, Blake did eventually join her, but his attention remained divided between his phone and whatever crisis management strategy he and Amber had developed. Even during what should have been an intimate moment between husband and wife facing the birth of their first child together, Blake seemed more concerned with damage control than with Sarah's welfare. "The Peterson deal can't be affected by this," Blake was saying into his phone. "We need to control the narrative. Make sure the press focuses on the medical emergency, not the circumstances leading up to it." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to focus on her breathing, on the new life about to enter the world despite the chaos surrounding her arrival. Whatever else happened tonight, whatever revelations about Blake's betrayal still awaited her, her daughter was coming. And Sarah was going to meet her baby as a woman who had finally stopped pretending that her marriage was something it had never actually been. The contractions were coming faster now, but they were nothing compared to the pain of recognition flooding through her. She was about to become a single mother, whether she'd planned it or not. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt like she was moving toward truth rather than away from it. The labor and delivery unit at Metro General buzzed with efficient activity that felt honest after hours of social performance. Sarah was transferred to a private room where monitors began tracking her contractions and the baby's heart rate. The medical environment provided refuge from the constant fear of criticism that had characterized her evening. Dr. Rachel Thompson, the attending physician, checked Sarah's progress with professional calm. "You're at 7 centimeters, she announced. "This baby is definitely coming tonight. How are you feeling about pain management?" "Whatever you recommend," Sarah replied, grateful to have someone else making decisions based on medical expertise rather than social appearances. Blake paced near the window, still fielding calls about reputation management. Through the glass door, Sarah could see him gesturing animatedly. His conversation focused on minimizing damage to his business relationships rather than supporting his wife through labor. Sarah, Jake said quietly, pulling up a chair beside her bed. I need to tell you something about Dad and Amber. Sarah's attention sharpened despite another contraction building. What do you mean? Jake glanced toward the door where Blake continued his phone conversations. I've been recording his calls for the past 3 months. On my phone, I know it sounds crazy, but I could tell something was wrong, and I wanted to protect you. The revelation that Jake had been conducting his own surveillance operation surprised Sarah, but it also provided the validation she'd been seeking. If Blake's teenage son could see what was happening, how long had everyone else been aware? What did you hear? Sarah asked. Conversations about moving money to offshore accounts. Discussions with Amber about timeline acceleration. And Sarah, Jake's young face was tight with protective anger. Amber's pregnant too. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. All the air seemed to leave the room as she processed what Jake was telling her. Amber wasn't just Blake's business partner or even his mistress. She was carrying his child, which meant Blake had been planning to leave Sarah long before her own pregnancy was even announced. How long have you known? Sarah managed. I figured it out last month when I overheard them talking about doctor's appointments and due dates. Sarah, they've been planning this whole thing for over a year. The business expansion, the asset transfers, everything. They were just waiting for the right time to make their move. Another contraction peaked. But Sarah barely felt it compared to the emotional devastation of understanding how completely she'd been deceived. Blake hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been systematically dismantling their marriage, while she'd been focused on preparing for motherhood. Dr. Thompson returned to check Sarah's progress. We're at 9 centimeters now. Your baby should be here within the hour. As if summoned by the medical update, Blake finally ended his call and approached the bed. How are we doing? He asked, his tone suggesting concern, but Sarah could see the calculation behind his eyes. We're doing fine, Sarah replied carefully. Jake was just telling me about some interesting conversations he's been overhearing. Blake's expression sharpened as he looked at his son, then back at Sarah. Jake, maybe you should wait into the family area. This is between your stepmother and me. Actually, Sarah said, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. I want Jake to stay. He's the only family member who's been honest with me lately. Blake's jaw tightened. Sarah, you're in labor. This isn't the time for accusations or drama. You're right, Sarah agreed. This is the time for truth. How long have you been planning to leave me, Blake, before I got pregnant or after? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with the weight of 18 months of systematic deception. Blake's careful composure flickered as he realized that his wife was no longer the confused, self-doting woman he'd been manipulating. I don't know what Jake thinks he heard, Blake began, but Sarah cut him off. I know about the Cayman accounts. I know about the asset transfers. And I know about Amber's pregnancy. Blake's face went pale. He understood that his carefully constructed exit strategy had been compromised. The woman he'd dismissed as emotionally fragile and financially dependent had somehow assembled enough information to threaten everything he'd built. Another contraction hit, stronger than the previous ones, and Sarah realized that she was about to give birth to her daughter in the middle of exposing her husband's betrayal. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. She was literally giving birth to new life while her old life died around her. Sarah, Blake said carefully, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used for difficult business negotiations. I think you're misunderstanding some legitimate business activities. The stress of pregnancy can make women paranoid. Stop, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying more strength than she'd felt in months. I'm done with your gaslighting. I'm done with your size, and I'm done pretending that our marriage is something it never actually was. Dr. Thompson appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Harrison, it's time to push. Emma Harrison entered the world at 2:17 in the morning, healthy and beautiful, with her mother's determined chin and what Sarah hoped would be a stronger sense of self-worth than either of her parents had demonstrated. The moment Sarah held her daughter, everything else in the room fell away. This tiny person was hers completely, purely hers in a way that had nothing to do with performance or appearances. She's perfect, Sarah whispered, studying Emma's delicate features. Her daughter was real, honest, uncomplicated by the deception that had characterized the adult relationships in her life. Blake's first words upon seeing his daughter revealed everything Sarah needed to know about his priorities. "Good," he said, his voice carrying calculation rather than wonder. "She looks like your side of the family. That should help with the custody arrangements." The casual cruelty of the comment hit Sarah like physical violence. Blake was already planning their divorce, already strategizing about how to minimize his financial obligations and maximize his access to Emma when it suited his schedule. But his comment also revealed something he probably hadn't intended. He'd been thinking about custody arrangements long enough to have developed preferences about Emma's appearance. This wasn't a decision made in the heat of tonight's crisis. This was a plan that had been developing for months. Dr. Thompson finished the medical procedures and left them alone with their daughter. In the quiet hours after Emma's birth, while Blake handled what he called necessary communications with his lawyer, Sarah experienced her first moments of pure love and clarity in longer than she could remember. Jake had fallen asleep in the bedside chair, his teenage frame folded awkwardly but his presence comforting. Near dawn, while Sarah was nursing Emma and Blake was absent handling another urgent call, Jake stirred and noticed something on the windowsill. "That's not he observed, his voice still thick with sleep. Sarah looked where he was pointing. Amber's distinctive designer handbag sat on the ledge, apparently left behind during the confusion of the evening's medical emergency. "Amber must have forgotten it," Sarah said, though something about the abandoned purse felt significant in a way she couldn't immediately identify. Jake got up and moved toward the bag with teenage curiosity. As he picked it up, it fell open, spilling its contents across the hospital room floor. What scattered across the linoleum wasn't the usual collection of lipstick and credit cards that Sarah would have expected. Instead, she saw hotel room keys from expensive hotels in the city, travel documents for flights she hadn't known Amber had taken, and a manila folder marked Harrison Asset Distribution in Amber's neat handwriting. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying adult understanding that made her chest tighten. "I think you need to see this." Sarah shifted Emma to one arm and accepted the folder Jake handed her. Inside were financial documents that made her blood run cold despite the warm hospital room. Bank statements for accounts she'd never seen. Property deeds for investments she'd never been told about. And a legal memo outlining strategies for high net worth divorce proceedings. The documents were dated going back 18 months, exactly when Amber had first appeared in their lives as Blake's business consultant. This wasn't a recent affair that had spiraled out of control. This was a systematic, long-term plan to restructure Blake's financial life in preparation for ending their marriage. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her free hand trembling as she turned pages that detailed the methodical dismantling of the financial security she'd thought they were building together. Jake moved closer, his young face serious with protective anger. "What is it, evidence?" Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Evidence that I'm not crazy, and I'm not paranoid, and I haven't been imagining things." The quiet strength that had been building since her water broke in front of 400 people crystallized into something harder and more determined. Sarah realized she wasn't just holding her newborn daughter, she was holding the future they would build together. Free from the lies and manipulation that had defined the past 18 months, Blake returned as Sarah was carefully replacing the documents in Amber's folder. His phone was finally silent for the first time since they'd arrived at the hospital. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, the possessive pronoun grating against Sarah's newly awakened awareness. "We're doing well," Sarah replied carefully. Amber left her purse. Jake found it. Blake's eyes flicked to the bag, then to Jake, then back to Shra. For just a moment, his careful composure slipped, revealing something calculating and concerned beneath his practiced charm. "I'll make sure she gets it back," Blake said, reaching for the purse. But Sarah held on to the folder, her grip firm despite her exhaustion. "Actually, I think I should return it personally. We need to talk anyway." Blake's expression sharpened. "About what?" Sarah looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at her husband. "About the future, about what kind of life we're going to build for our daughter." "Sarah," Blake said, his tone carrying a warning, "you're exhausted. This isn't the time for major conversations." But Sarah had spent 6 years deferring important conversations until more convenient times that never seemed to arrive. She'd postponed discussions about finances until Blake was less busy, delayed questions about their relationship until he was less stressed, put off addressing her concerns until moments that never materialized. "No," she said firmly, "this is exactly the time, while everything is honest and clear, and there's no room for pretending anymore." 3 weeks after Emma's birth, Sarah sat in the law offices of Morrison, Carter and Associates, nursing her daughter while reviewing financial documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 years. Her friend Dana Brooks had recommended the firm after her own investigation into Blake's business practices had revealed federal violations that extended far beyond simple asset concealment. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt like a war room, with documents spread across every available surface and Dana's laptop displaying flowcharts that tracked money movement across multiple offshore accounts. Sarah had never imagined she'd be fluent in terms like asset forfeiture and criminal conspiracy, but desperation had made her an excellent student. The offshore accounts alone represent $4.2 million in marital assets, attorney Frank Carter explained, spreading bank statements across the conference table. But the business partnership with Ms. Wells appears to involve tax avoidance schemes that the IRS would find very interesting. Sarah had spent the past weeks assembling evidence with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that her survival depended on documentation. Jake's recordings provided proof of Blake's intent to defraud her. Amber's forgotten purse had contained a roadmap of their financial crimes. And Dana's investigative journalism background had helped connect dots that revealed the full scope of Blake's betrayal. "The beautiful irony," Dana added, looking up from her laptop, "is that Blake documented everything. He's so arrogant, he never thought anyone would be smart enough to piece it together. Every email, every bank transfer, every shell company formation has his digital fingerprints all over it." Frank nodded grimly. Narcissists often create their own evidence trails. They can't resist demonstrating their cleverness, even when it exposes their crimes. "What are our options?" Sarah asked, adjusting Emma's position as her daughter finished nursing. "Civil recovery of assets, criminal referrals for fraud, and family court proceedings for custody and support." Frank replied, "But there's something else you should know. Ms. Wells contacted our office yesterday. She wants to cooperate." The revelation that Amber was willing to turn on Blake surprised Sarah, though she was beginning to understand that desperation made people do unexpected things. Faced with potential federal charges, Amber had apparently decided that Blake wasn't worth prison time. What does she want in exchange? Immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony about Mr. Harrison's financial crimes. She's prepared to provide documentation of the entire asset concealment scheme. Apparently, Blake kept her in the dark about some of the more serious violations. When she realized the scope of the criminal activity, she got scared. Dana's fingers flew over her keyboard as she pulled up another document. "It gets better. I've been tracking Blake's real estate transactions, and he's been using shell companies to purchase properties that he never intended to declare as marital assets. Some of these purchases violate federal banking regulations. The Peterson deal he was so obsessed with, it's connected to a money laundering operation that's been under federal surveillance for 6 months." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction as she processed the scope of Blake's legal troubles. The man who'd dismissed her as paranoid and emotionally unstable was about to face consequences that would dwarf her own struggles. Every sleepless night she'd spent questioning her own perceptions, every moment of self-doubt he'd cultivated, now seemed like preparation for this moment of the clarity. "There's one more thing," Frank continued, his expression growing more serious. "The Peterson deal that was so important to him, it appears to involve money laundering for a client who's been under federal investigation for tax evasion. Blake's business empire isn't just built on deception, it's built on criminal activity that could put him away for decades." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah had thought Blake was simply a cheating husband who'd hidden some money. The reality was far more serious and far more dangerous than she'd imagined. "What does this mean for Emma's safety?" Sarah asked, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. "Federal prosecutors will want to ensure that victims and witnesses are protected," Frank assured her. "Your daughter's welfare will be a priority in any plea negotiations. Blake's access to her will likely be severely restricted, possibly eliminated entirely if he's convicted of serious felonies." Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, and Sarah looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. This tiny person deserved better than to grow up as collateral damage in her father's schemes for financial fraud and emotional manipulation. But she also deserved to grow up knowing that her mother had fought for justice, not just for revenge. "I want to proceed with everything," Sarah said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "Civil recovery, criminal referrals, the full legal response. But I also want to make sure Emma is protected from as much of this as possible." Dana's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and smiled grimly. "It's my source at the UPM's attorney's office. The federal investigation into Blake's business practices just got a lot more serious." As Dana stepped out to take the call, Frank gathered the most damaging documents into a secure folder. "Sarah, I want you to understand something. What you're embarking on will be difficult and emotionally draining. Blake will likely try to intimidate you, discredit you, maybe even threaten you. Are you prepared for that level of conflict?" Sarah thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, afraid to question a credit card charge, apologizing for her husband's behavior, making herself smaller to accommodate his ego. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who'd been forged in the fire of public humiliation and private betrayal. "Frank," she said quietly, "I've been living in conflict for years. I just didn't realize I was allowed to fight back." Dana returned from her call, her expression mixing satisfaction with concern. "The federal task force wants to meet with us next week. They're very interested in Jake's recordings and Amber's documentation. But, Sarah, they also want you to consider testifying before a grand jury. This could become very public, very quickly." Sarah realized that the powerless pregnant woman who'd been humiliated at the gala 3 weeks ago no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, more determined, and fully committed to protecting her daughter from the kind of financial abuse and emotional manipulation that had nearly destroyed her own sense of reality. Blake had underestimated her, assuming that pregnancy and new motherhood would make her more vulnerable rather than more fierce. He was about to discover that the woman he'd dismissed as expendable had resources, allies, and determination he'd never bothered to assess. The battle for Emma's future and Sarah's freedom was just beginning. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt confident about her chances of winning. More than that, she felt like she was finally fighting for something worth defending. The ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel looked exactly the same as it had on the night Emma was born. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over another gathering of the city's elite. But everything else had fundamentally changed for Sarah Mitchell. She'd reclaimed her maiden name, who stood near the silent auction tables wearing a dress of her own choosing and carrying her 6-month-old daughter with the confidence of a woman who'd learned to trust her own judgment. Tonight's event was the dedication of the Metro Children's Hospital's new pediatric wing, now officially named the Emma Mitchell Memorial Wing, in honor of Sarah's separate donation. The funding had come from her share of the recovered assets that Blake had attempted to hide. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that Blake's efforts to conceal their money had ultimately provided her with the resources needed to build an independent life. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Patterson approached with genuine warmth, "thank you again for your generosity. The new wing has already transformed our ability to serve young patients and their families." Sarah smiled, adjusting Emma's position in her arms. Her daughter had grown into a beautiful, alert baby who seemed to find the world endlessly fascinating. "It's important that families can stay together during medical crises," Sarah replied, echoing Blake's words from that devastating night 6 months ago. But when she spoke them, they carried the weight of lived experience rather than empty rhetoric. Jake appeared at her side, now 18, and somehow both taller and more mature than when this journey had begun. The legal proceedings had emancipated him from his father's custody, allowing him to choose where he wanted to live during his final year of high school. He'd chosen Sarah, cementing a family bond that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with loyalty and love. "Dana's here," Jake reported, scanning the crowd for Sarah's best friend, who'd become not just emotional support, but business partner in Sarah's new venture. "She's setting up the camera equipment for the dedication ceremony." Sarah's new life had unexpected dimensions she couldn't have imagined during those dark months of her marriage. Dana's journalism background had led them to create a consulting firm that helped women identify financial abuse and hidden assets. Together, they built something powerful, a support network for women who'd been systematically undermined by partners who confuse control with love. "Any word from your father?" Sarah asked Jake, though the question was asked more from curiosity than concern. "His lawyer sent the usual settlement demands," Jake replied, "but his negotiating position gets weaker every month as more evidence surfaces." Blake's legal troubles had multiplied beyond the initial charges of asset concealment and financial fraud. Amber's cooperation with federal investigators had revealed a network of tax avoidance schemes that had attracted attention from multiple agencies. His real estate empire was being systematically dismantled to pay fines and settlements that grew larger with each new investigation. Amber herself had accepted a plea agreement that required her to testify against Blake in exchange for reduced charges. The sophisticated businesswoman who'd been so confident about displacing Sarah was now working as a paralegal while completing court-ordered community service. Her pregnancy had ended in miscarriage during the stress of the federal investigation, eliminating one complication from an already complex situation. As the dedication ceremony began, Sarah felt the weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been Mrs. Blake Harrison, perfect accessory to her husband's ambitions. Tonight, she was Sarah Mitchell, successful consultant, single mother, and survivor of systematic financial abuse, who'd rebuilt her life on foundations of honesty rather than appearance. The applause for her brief speech about family support during medical crises was warm and sustained, but Sarah noticed that several people in the crowd were checking their phones rather than meeting her eyes. The social dynamics that had once intimidated her now seemed manageable and sometimes amusing. She no longer needed their approval or feared their judgment. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself approached by several women with questions that had nothing to do with charitable donations. "I've heard you're helping women with financial investigations," said one woman whose husband Sarah recognized as one of Blake's former business associates. "Could we perhaps have coffee sometime?" Sarah had received dozens of similar inquiries over the past months, often from women who'd been watching their own marriages with growing unease. She handed over her business card with the satisfaction of someone who'd turned her worst experience into her greatest strength. As the evening wound down, Sarah stood in the same spot where her water had broken 6 months ago, holding Emma and watching the crowd disperse. The transformation from that humiliating night to this moment of genuine triumph felt like evidence of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dana. "Federal sentencing hearing scheduled for Blake next month. Prosecutors recommending 5 to 7 years." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was studying the crystal chandelier with serious baby concentration, then deleted the message without responding. Blake's consequences were his own responsibility now. She had a business to run, a daughter to raise, and a life to build that belonged entirely to her. The story that had begun with public humiliation and private betrayal had evolved into something neither Blake nor Amber could have anticipated: complete transformation of the woman they dismissed as expendable. Sarah had discovered that the most powerful revenge was refusing to remain a victim, and the most satisfying justice was building a life so authentic and fulfilling that her previous existence seemed like a performance she'd been hired to give for someone else's benefit. She was finally, completely herself. And that person was stronger, wiser, and more capable than anyone, including Sarah, had ever imagined possible. The future stretched ahead with unlimited possibility, and Sarah was ready to meet it on her own terms.